Hey everybody, Pete Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. So those of you who don't know, we are doing live video episodes first. They release as a live episode. You can watch that primarily on YouTube on the regular channel, but also if you watch on Facebook Live or on Twitter. We're going to try to go over to Instagram Live soon, but that change is going to be probably in July when we launch that. Step by step, you do these things. Either way, you will always have access to the podcast in its regular traditional podcast form, and we will work on continuing to bring you fantastic episodes as we always have. Today's guest is a return guest, Joshua Dudley, who works at the Epoch Times, and he is their senior correspondent who has covered China for over 10 years. His knowledge of what China is about and how the politics of China impact everybody's well-being is remarkable. They have sources on the inside, people who send them governmental documents, all kinds of things that they then push out in form of news. Here's the thing that's crazy. Because of China's influence commercially, a lot of the traditional media outlets aren't able to accurately cover it for fear of losing revenue because, let's face it, news is tied to revenue. But the Epoch Times doesn't do that. They are started by Chinese dissidents, and so they come at things directly, and their stories are often rejected in hand when they first come out. But then over time, more and more places start to report, and it turns out things like organ harvesting and basically concentration camps for folks who don't fit within the party, those things are real, and they really happen. Back when the COVID crisis was first out, I actually met with Joshua in New York, right when everything was shutting down, when Italy was just about to shut down. New York was already quiet as a ghost town. And we talked a lot about that. And that episode is in the show notes, and you can hear what he was thinking ahead of that. Well, here we are 3 months later, and we are talking about COVID again and what we've learned and what he has found out in terms of the origin of it. He doesn't think it's man-made. He thinks it is a natural-made thing, but there also still does not appear to be a viable tie to the Wuhan Market in terms of the outbreak. This wasn't started with bats. It really does seem like, according to what everything they've seen from internal Chinese documents from the government all the way to their other reporting, that this is a lab outbreak. So we don't know everything yet, but that does seem to be where the information is pushing us. It's a fascinating story. Erik Kleinsmith joins us today. He used to be my commander in Bosnia, so he's a commander of spies and understands analysis. And one of the things we do with him on the show is compare what Joshua does and like what I do, and he is an analyst, like what he's trying to do. And basically it's like reporters tell you what has happened and intel folks try to predict what might happen next. A fascinating episode with Joshua, Erik, and myself. And actually, Erik and I hung on and did a part 2 for this episode talking about Antifa and analysis. So that show is not going to be up for a little while, but definitely go check that out on YouTube. You're not going to get that kind of analysis on how to break down a decentralized group like Antifa and put our hands wrapped around it. And we also deal with the question of, if Antifa is a terrorist organization, why not the Boogaloo Boys? Why not the KKK? And we dive into those things. Anyhow, that's that episode. This episode is about Joshua Philipp from the Epoch Times, and I know you're going to love it. You're not going to hear this kind of stuff anywhere else. Definitely check out Joshua's show, Crossroads, on YouTube. Again, link in the show notes, and always check out his reporting. If you're curious about China and you're not down with what Joshua's reporting, you are not getting the full story. All right. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. Let's hit that button. Let's support veterans trying to not kill themselves, right? We can all get behind that. Okay, a couple of big things coming up. I'll be doing some announcements later in the week, but I know you're going to love today's show with Joshua Philipp.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Joshua Philipp, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is interesting. We have a couple of intel guys, myself and obviously Captain Kleinsmith from my olden days. Now he's just Erik Kleinsmith. He's great at analysis and understanding, how these things work. And as a field intelligence guy, I'm sort of like a reporter. So in effect, like we would be a good team to do what you do, Joshua, for a living at the Epoch Times, is being an investigative journalist. So I thought it might be a good way to have this conversation to talk about current events because it turns out there's a lot of craziness going on in the world.
It's a nice way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, man, what the hell's going on? Like, you're in New York City and we have all this stuff with COVID and everything, but also now we have all the rioting and the protesting for the, I mean, it's just the police violence thing in general, like overall. But what are you seeing on the streets as you're doing the ground truth thing out there in New York?
Well, during the mornings, you don't really see too much going on. I mean, I've seen maybe 5-6 people walking around with billboards, just going to and from the office. You don't really see too much around the city. If you want to see the protesters, you go to like Washington Square Park, those areas, and yeah, you'll see them. The violence, the riots, that kind of stuff really takes place after hours, and I mean, you have to kind of go seek it out pretty much. It is here. It is very large scale, but if you're not in the hotspot areas, you're not going to see it too much. That said, I mean, in front of Gracie Mansion, but de Blasio's mansion, they did have thousands of protesters out there calling for his resignation. Interestingly, at the same time, you have Cuomo angry at de Blasio. You also have the police angry at de Blasio. De Blasio is not calling in the National Guard. They're all angry at him for different reasons, and you still have looters. If you were to ask my opinion, I would say this is multiple protests. I think a lot of media have made the mistake of trying to bunch all the protesters into the same basket. There are very different factions, very different reasonings for being out there, very different activities they're doing. There are large-scale peaceful protests. There are large-scale protests, say some calling for government change. There are some who just want to show solidarity with this man who was killed. They're all there for different reasons. There are some who just appear to be gangs out there just saying, hey, this is an opportunity to go commit crime and let's go do it. So you have that pretty heavily as well.
And Joshua, you just highlighted an article that I wrote that really talks about how this is a toxic mix of 3 major elements. You have your legitimate protesters, but then you have your criminal elements, and then you have your radical political elements. And each, when you, as you mix these together, you get as soon as you get an overwhelming of law and order, that's when you're seeing the breakdown, and that's when you're seeing the violence or the looting, depending on which group is doing it.
And you're also seeing a demoralization of the police.
Yeah.
Where, it's complicated stuff when you get into the different issues of police. Of course, this individual who was killed, this Floyd, it's coming out now that the coroner's report is saying that he actually had COVID-19.
Yes.
And there's different articles about what exactly happened. The official report said he died of a heart attack. That maybe the method of arrest made that worse. He was on fentanyl at the time that he had that, and he also was recently on methamphetamine. So he did have drugs in his system. Maybe the stress of the incident triggered the heart attack. There was an independent analysis that claimed that he died from the pressure put on his neck. That was done by the family. When you talk about independent analysis, I mean, look, like what I'm saying right now, you could call it independent analysis. If I were to say, I believe this happened, you could write articles saying, independent analyst says he died from such and such. Not to discredit that fully, but I'm just saying independent analysis, you got to take for what it is. It's the person might have biases. The person, if he was hired by the family, maybe he was serving the interest of the family. There are other interests come into play, and so you have to take it for what it is.
But I think you also have to
trying to undermine this at all.
You also have to take into account when it is too. Like, this is the gathering of the evidence. I'm positive the defense is going to have a third autopsy done, and there's going to be we don't know enough to know anything. We know what we've seen. We know it's horrible and a tragedy, but there's a lot of work to do to understand what the hell happened, and that goes way before what the hell do we do about it. As a nation, as a police force, as a society. Like we got to get over the emotional part, of course, but at some point, the real work, the investigation has to happen.
I think to Joshua's point, I don't think it for a lot of the actors and a lot of the elements, it really doesn't matter at this point. They've already made up their mind, and you're seeing agendas that have nothing to do with George Floyd that have mixed into this. So it really doesn't matter to them. It's just the fact that it happened, and now we can use this to take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, and that's another thing too. I mentioned the police are being demoralized right now.
Yeah.
For example, one of these sergeants associations in New York, they came out, they criticized Cuomo, governor of New York, for basically attacking the police, blaming the police. They're attacking De Blasio. They're saying De Blasio is attacking them because De Blasio is holding them accountable for any actions. It's like, well, how do you expect us to do our job if you're not calling in the National Guard and we're dealing with really, oftentimes violent riots? You had 2 officers shot, 1 stabbed, I think just last night in New York. And so officers are being attacked, and they're afraid for their lives. They're surrounded by individuals. They don't know who's hostile, who's not. You have the New York health commissioners saying that if people catch the virus, blame the police because of the tear gas apparently affects the lungs and makes it worse. And so if they can't disperse crowds, if they can't arrest people, what do you expect to be doing out there? They're demoralized right now. And when it comes to the police officers involved in the death of this Mr. Floyd, it's complicated too, because I talked to some police officers, and it's complicated. Now, they said the way that officer put his knee on that guy's neck, it was a jerk move. It's something. It's not cool to do that. The guy was being a jerk.
Right.
But according to the actual protocols of that department, because every department's going to have its own protocols, and the protocols of that department, that was not unethical behavior. That is approved behavior. And so, in other words, they were acting within approved behavior, even though it was a jerk thing to do. It wasn't technically illegal. And so the arrest of these individuals, it's a lynching. It's a political move to arrest them.
Right.
They were not in violation of things. They should have been let go. There should have been an investigation. It's a lynching. We're watching a lynching take place right now, and officers are being sent a message that if they follow protocol, if even when following protocol, if what they do is deemed not right by the crowd, by the mob, then they will be arrested and possibly sent to prison for a very long time. And so they're afraid to do their jobs. This is something we've seen happening for a very long time now with these protests against police violence. Then they're afraid to do their jobs, and what happens when they're afraid to do their jobs? Well, they stop enforcing crime. They stop going after criminals. Crime goes up. Communities get worse. They start demanding change. And then I think the people who benefit from this at the end are the government actors, the political actors, who are trying to push for more government power anyways. And that's one of the real ironies of all of this, is that, just talking honestly, this is about politics. You have different political factions. Most of them are pushing for socialist type government controls, but socialism exists through the exertion of power. That's the difference between normal community and normal, say, goodness of heart donations versus forced equality, forced donations, forced stealing of your wealth, redistribution. What happens if you don't go along with it? They send police to your door and they arrest you. You can't have these social policies without the enforcement of power. And so it's ironic that they're calling for a stamping down of power, while at the same time calling for the most totalitarian systems we could possibly have. It's bizarre stuff. It's a bizarre situation, and really, in my opinion, 99% of people are just being driven by emotion right now. Maybe 1% of people are actually trying to use this for their own political gain.
I want to make sure I say out loud, just for everybody watching, we're talking about a tragedy when the police encounter somebody and someone dies. Doesn't matter what color they are. Doesn't matter what country they're from. It's horrible that this outcome has happened. We're not going to lose sight of that. But now that that's happened, how do we deal with the social aftermath? Because
and agreed, of course.
Right,
yeah.
of course, right. And because it's easy to seem that we're being callous about this, but we're talking about the bigger picture. Like, imagine the world when 3 of these 4 cops get off completely because they did follow procedure, because this is at manslaughter, and then maybe the other guy does 6 years for manslaughter, whatever, but there's a probability well in excess of 0 that not all of these cops are going to get murder one. Like, but that's what the emotional part is, right? So we have work to do to understand that. And then what happens? Another round of protests and everything else. And like you said, this continues to erode at our ability to police ourselves effectively as a society, because you have someone that's got a degree in criminal justice and 10 years on the force, and they see this coming down the pipe. They're like, you know what? I can do other things. I don't need to be in the street. And our quality of officers, we think it's a problem now. Like, one of the things people always say is like, just more training. But the training officer at any department is not like, I wish I had people to train. I wish I could spend all this training money. Like, no, like, these things cost money. And to get the police force that we want, we have to treat that police force differently than we're treating it now. We have to fund it with a lot more money. A third of the force has to always be in some kind of training. Like, these things are enormously expensive to get these things out. And then the other part of this is you do reach a point of, just in terms of its systems, you reach a point of diminishing returns, where the act of trying to squash out all police violence creates more violence. Because that's just how systems work. As you go higher and higher into the percentiles on trying to eliminate these things. As a reporter, how do you wrestle with all of these problems? This is I always say social problems are multivariate problems, but it's true. This is not a simple cut and dry thing where this guy murdered this guy and all cops suck. It just isn't the truth.
Well, as a reporter, maybe my views are a bit different than the way some journalists would approach this. I really try to aspire towards what I would call traditional journalism. In other words, the type of journalism that the public expects from you. And my take on journalism is the reason people watch the news, the reason they read newspapers is because they want to have a clear understanding of what is taking place. I think there's a lot of media that believe the role of journalists is to give opinion, but honestly, I think people have a surplus and overabundance of opinion right now. You want to hear opinion, go on Twitter, post 2 sentences about your political views on Facebook. You'll get plenty of opinion.
Right.
I think people have too much of it. Now, my take is when I report, I make an effort to not be moved by it. I make an effort to not be attached to it. I make an effort to put down my own emotions. I mean, for example, so I don't think I've ever said this publicly before, but people ask me what my political views are. I don't vote. And that's for me part of what it means to be a journalist. I don't want to get involved in the political process. And I've gone back and forth with myself over, that, because of course I do, as a journalist, I do see who's being honest, who's being dishonest. I do see who is credible and who is not. But in my opinion, as soon as I start putting myself too deeply into the political process, then it's going to start affecting my reporting, and I'm going to start caring about these things more than I should. And that makes me want to say things that support my views and and push down things that don't support my views. And I don't want to be like that. And to be honest, it's a difficult process because the news these days is very agitating, but especially when you're a journalist and you're watching for 6-8 hours a day videos of violence, videos of these different incidents. You're watching press conferences. You're seeing the full context of information. You're reading transcripts of documents. The context. The background. Who's saying what. Who's lying. Who's telling the truth. Who's playing politics. There are some journalists who turn a blind eye to a lot of those things, and because it fits their own political interests. And again, it's not easy to not be moved by it. And I mean, I've been guilty in the past, of being too moved by stories and getting pulled into things. And I find myself often having to take a step back, reflecting on myself and putting those things down again, and trying to be more responsible. So it's an ongoing process. I won't say I'm perfect, but I make an ongoing effort to not be too moved by what I'm watching, because as soon as I'm moved by what I'm watching, that's when I start putting too much emotion into what I say, and that's when I also start not wanting to tell the full story, and I don't want to be like that.
Have you found, I mean, and this is trends over the years that the mass media that we're relying upon has moved from informing to persuading. And I know you're stating that you're resisting that tide, but has that affected you in terms of opportunities and careers, or resistance, or additional challenges that specific challenges that you have to overcome because of that?
Absolutely. So one of my big pet peeves with I can't. I'll be honest. I can't stand a lot of the media. There are issues. There are issues with the conservative and liberal media. A lot of conservatives, for example, they only want to write opinion content. A lot of the conservative media, they're more like blogs. Maybe Breitbart's an exemption. Breitbart, maybe a Daily Caller. They're okay. But it's all within their camps for the most part, right? They have their opinions, and that's where they stay. And so when I read news, I don't follow any one website. I usually use an RSS feed, and I just search for keywords based on the beats I follow, and I'll read articles from every news outlet. When I do want to cover a story, I'll go and find the sources of their reports, and I'll read the sources myself. And when you do that, you do find that a lot of media, more so the big media, they do cherry pick information. They do pull quotes out of context. You see it every single day. And when you see that every single day, there's something that bothers me, right? Which is, people rely on journalism to inform them about the world. A person's worldview is shaped by the news that they are given. And if they're being given incomplete information or false information, they're going to have a false picture of the world. The reality that they live in will be false. And in my opinion, because I've been doing this since 2006, and I put a lot of effort into being as honest as I possibly can as a reporter, that stuff bothers me. Seeing how journalists can just willfully mislead people and willfully lie to people like that, it really bothers me. And maybe part of my own will to be not like that is because it bothers me so much. I think it's irresponsible. I think it is damaging to a society when you're misleading people like that. A lot of what you see, and now more to your question, a lot of what you see in journalism is advocacy journalism. This goes into the trends of new journalism, they call it, started up around the 60s. And here's how it works. It's based on leading people through emotional processes, and then you tie the you tie that emotional reaction to a political issue. And so, for example, if I want to promote a political issue, say against sanctuary city policies, or for sanctuary city policies, let's say, I'm going to go to the border and I'm going to find the person who has the saddest story I can possibly find. And I'm going to write this big, long narrative piece and make this person into a folk hero. And I'm going to pull quotes out of context. And then I'm going to go cherry pick interviews from different experts who will say, oh, yeah, this is, an example of abuse in the society, historical racism, these types of things. And I'm gonna lead people through the emotional journey of this individual who has this sob story. And by the end of it, people will have experienced that emotional journey. They will feel that they have been through that. And then I'm going to tell them that emotional feeling you have, that feeling you have, is an example, right? It is an example of this political issue. And so what happens, just like Pavlov's dog, where you're conditioning a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell every time, you show it food, you ring a bell, it salivates. Eventually you ring the bell and it salivates. Eventually the keywords, political words like illegal immigration, for example, become stimuli that elicit an emotional reaction. People will respond to these stimuli based on the things that you've conditioned them to experience. And new journalism is based on that. And I think it is appalling. I think it is terrible. I think it is damaging to society that journalists do that. But a lot of news, that is what a lot of news these days is about. That is exactly what they do nonstop. It is agitation propaganda. That's what the communists, socialists would call it, agitation propaganda. You're agitating people emotionally and making them associate those emotions with political issues, and then you're using that to manipulate them. A lot of media are doing this. And so in my work, I put in active effort to not do that.
And it's one of the reasons why I like having you on the show, because you are a what I'll call a traditional journalist. It's the kind of journalist I was taught to be, in my undergrad work. Was like there's no cheering in the in the press box, that kind of thing. Like, I'm going to report what happens. And I've been watching a lot of the White House press briefings, and it's just shocking to me the quality of questions. Like, here you have this enormous responsibility for your news organization, and you have this chance to ask a question that will really shine light on some aspect of it, and the quality of questions. It's as a guy who asks questions for a living in dangerous places, I can't believe that this is what they do with this opportunity. Is to ask these, I don't know, like almost ego-based questions. It really drives me crazy, and it damages society in general. I wanted to ask Erik to your thoughts on this too. Like, the work that we had to do trying to gather intel, and I'm sending it to you. When I put my report together, I will put my analysis in there, but ultimately I'm trying to give you bits of information to process, and I'm trying to take me out of those bits as much as possible, because my job is to tell you things you're not going to otherwise know. Journalism is the same thing. What do you see in terms of the quality of analysis and the quality of information that comes out from reporters when you see them act in real time?
Well, the motions that reporting and intelligence work is relatively the same, but it stops at one area where a reporter is supposed to say, here is what happened. And then and to Joshua's point, you're getting then narratives and agendas and, certain biases that are put in it. But for an intel person, they're going to get a grade, and the grade is because their job is to say, here's what is going to happen. That's why investigators and intel folks, that's where they split, the past versus future. Intel's job is to specifically support a decision maker and saying, this is what's going to happen based upon the same information. This is what I think. Well, you're going to find out in 12, 24, 36 hours, or long-term, from a strategic sense, 6 months, whether you were right or wrong. And after you've been right or wrong for a certain amount of times, the trust is in the decision maker. Whereas for a reporter, it's their ratings. Like, this guy's been wrong every time. Why am I tuning into this channel, or why am I reading this source? But for intel, you lose a customer's trust. And example is, to go back to the COVID thing. It was a quote from Dr. Birx, from White House coronavirus coordinator. And one of the quotes she stated, she goes, there is nothing coming out of the CDC that I could trust. And it doesn't matter your politics or whether you believe, if you don't like Trump, you don't like her, you don't like what's going on. It's the fact that a decision maker who had to rely upon you as an organization, multi-millions of dollars spent into putting this information together and doing analysis and saying, this is what we think is going to template for the future. Your primary customer says, I can't trust anything that you're doing. You've just lost you've just failed in your primary mission. And reporting is kind of the same thing. So I'm just drawing some basic, academic differences between intel and reporting, but you run into the same problems. And that's why the same problems that Joshua is highlighting, I get completely appalled and disgusted seeing the same thing, and is spending time as an information warrior. As my last job was chief of intel for land information warfare activity, and seeing how we used to harvest media reports all the time. Now you're seeing it's like you say, it's advocacy journalism, it's narratives, it's finding the right source that will fit your narrative. As I just was talking to somebody the other night through social media, and he was complaining about Trump's photo op in Lafayette Park, and said, well, they used tear gas and they did all this other stuff, and the bishop of the Episcopalian bishop of DC came out and was appalled by it. It's like, well, then that bishop needs to talk to the rector that actually works at the church, because the rector just said moments before on live TV that he thought it was a surreal moment without any anti-Trump bias. And then the argument goes back and forth. Well, then they used tear gas and they did all this other stuff. It's like, I got a brother in the Secret Service who's at the White House. He's been on the front lines for the past 2 nights in a row. He's had rocks, he's had bottles, he's had urine thrown at him. And it's not even his first riot, so he takes it all in stride. If they use tear gas, I'm okay with that, simply because I have a family member down there risking his life. And, again, it goes back to the same thing. It's like, well, this was a photo op. And if you remember when 1996, we had First Lady Hillary Clinton came to Tuzla, our air base. I had to divert 2 of our counterintelligence teams to do security for that photo op. And, that took them off their mission for several days to get ready for this visit.
I was one of those guys.
I know. Those guys run. I mean, we diverted you from your mission, and to me, it's like all Trump did was walk across the street, and it set everybody into a blur of a frenzy. It's just like you got to take things into a perspective. So, I mean, that's my long answer to your short question, but that's kind of the different things that are going through my mind as I see the same reporting that Joshua does.
I want to break some news right now. This is not on topic, but I'd like to scoop things, and especially with my respect for Joshua's work. Michael White, who's a service member who was held in captivity, arrested and in jail in Iran, has just been released in Switzerland. He was sent to Switzerland to get some treatment for his cancer, and he has just been released. So breaking news. There you go. I got the scoop on you, Joshua.
Nicely done.
Back. I want to hear what you think, though, about Erik's comments.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Nicely done.
Back. I want to hear what you think, though, about Erik's comments.
When it comes to diverting resources or the opinion element, which one?
In general, like with just your guys' kind of unified mistrust of things like the CDC, of like the press. What is that going to do? Like, do some predictive stuff, be the intel guy. Where does that lead us down the road if our... I don't want to say that you guys aren't mainstream media. Like, I'm tributary media. I'm a little small crick off the side of it, but you guys are an important part and you hold down your portion of the river. Where are we headed if we continue to do this editorialized, opinion-based, ads, selling ads first kind of media that doesn't allow us to understand what happens in the death of a citizen or in a pandemic outbreak if we just side with a political thing? I mean, it's crazy how 2 weeks ago people protesting peacefully and exercising their Second and First Amendment rights were going to kill everybody. It was going to be murder. And then now it's like, yeah, these other protesters, like, it doesn't make any damn sense. And we're not holding ourselves accountable in terms of in the press and in society.
Well, I think 2 points on that. First off, I think this virus, this pandemic we're in, has shown us that false reporting can cost lives. Because that's exactly what we saw with the Chinese Communist Party, where they lied to the world. They told the world there was no human to human transmission. They told the world that they had everything under control. They told the world that you're racist if you ban travel from China. And while they locked down travel within China from Wuhan, they were allowing people from Wuhan to travel abroad. And the CDC, the WHO, we're just repeating a lot of this nonsense. It was later seen to be nonsense. We know the WHO lied to us. We know the Chinese Communist Party was lying to the WHO. And somehow we're supposed to still rely on these organizations for information, even though we know they have a track record of lying to us. I mean, it is disturbing. At the same time, as a journalist, I mean, this is one of the issues I deal with a lot, is when you go against there's the main narrative. There's a thing everybody's saying. And often, a lot of times you do find that the main narrative has holes in it at the very least, if not it being totally inaccurate. So, for example, if I had told the world, which we did, notably at Epoch Times, that while the CDC and WHO were telling everyone, hey, that China has it under control, everything's safe, don't worry about it, we were still warning about it. People come out and attack us. They say we're fake news. They say that we're spreading, rumors that we're, if you had supported Trump on making this travel ban at the time when China had banned travel internally from Wuhan. That an external travel ban, if you didn't say it was racist, you would have been attacked. Now the whole world has seen that was the right choice. The good thing he did. Thank God he did. Otherwise, we'd probably be in a much worse situation than we are. You get attacked if you go against the grain. And I mean, and it's an ongoing process. I mean, and it's something we deal with a lot at Epoch Times, something I deal with a lot, that, you know, my analysis is oftentimes very different than what a lot of other media are saying. But sometimes being honest and being accurate means saying something different than what everyone else is saying. Do I put my own interest and my own not wanting to be called names on Twitter before my want to tell people what's actually taking place and doing my job? No. You know, you have to put yourself out there sometimes. You have to say things that people don't want to hear sometimes, because that is what they're depending. You know, people who want accurate news, that's what they're depending on you to do. And am I gonna, you know, cower around and, you know, be a wimp about it, or I'm not gonna want to tell people the truth because I don't want to be called names? No. And I think it's irresponsible to do that. But again, as an honest journalist, you oftentimes do have to do that. You oftentimes have to tell people things that goes against everything they've been told. And they're going to think you're lying to them when you first say that, because it goes against everything they've been told. It goes against everything that they think is real. And it's not these people's fault, in my opinion. You know, it's the natural reaction where you think something is real and you've been told it's real and everything you've seen says it's real. And then suddenly someone comes out and says it's not real. Of course, you're going to say, okay, what are you talking about? How are you saying this? And over time, this has been my analysis. So this has been how I approach these things over the years. I'll give you a few examples. Epoch Times was the first media to report on the live organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience in China. I think that was back in 2006. We had the first articles on that. And when we first reported on that, pretty much all the major organizations said we were lying, that, you know, we were just being propagandists, we're just anti-China, we'll just say whatever. And we kept reporting on it. And sure enough, now you have tribunals in the UK saying, doing independent studies and saying this is absolutely happening. The Chinese Communist Party is using prisoners of conscience as living sources for organ transplants. And they are doing this while they're still alive, oftentimes without painkillers. There is organ genocide taking place. There was a report on this just the other day, I think yesterday or the day before. Organ genocide taking place. And what media is talking about this? Epoch Times broke that story. We were widely attacked for reporting that, for exposing that. But sometimes, in order to tell people the truth, in order to expose really serious things, you need to put yourself in the firing line, and you need to hold your ground the entire time while you're saying it. And that, in my opinion, is just being responsible. You need to be willing to be criticized. You need to be willing to be attacked. You need to at the same time not attack people who criticize you, because in my opinion, over time, they will see that you had the story right.
Yeah, that credibility for the Epoch Times, it's shocking to me, because again, you're doing traditional journalism, you're asking the questions, you're putting all the knowledge together and going as far as not voting, which is remarkable. But the institution has a problem with credibility for sure. I looked up on Advantes Media, someone that Erik had introduced me to, Vanessa Otero, who runs that, and your guys' credibility ranking to them, because they're independent, it's above the bar. You guys are doing good work. Maybe you lean a little bit right. That's fine. Most every news organization has some kind of lean to it, but it's crazy how we can dismiss an entire news organization and every single person. If you were to qualify the amount of your reporting that is accurate, like my test for intel people is, it's like, you know, how accurate is your intel picture right now? And if they say anything more than 60%, I don't trust them, because they think too highly of their work. I'm not going to put that same standard on you, but what would be your answer? Like, when you report on these things, how close to 100% are you when you release things? Obviously you make mistakes, we all do, but what's your sense of that?
If I represent any information falsely, I will correct it immediately if I find out I did it falsely. And I do a show, Crossroads, on YouTube. I'll even tell people, hey, I got the story wrong, I apologize. And I tell them on my show, hey, if you think I'm missing anything, if you think anything wrong, tell me. You want to call me names in the comment section? Tell me. I'm thick-skinned. I'm not going to be offended by it. I'm not going to go cry in my corner. Tell me. I don't. If people send me hate mail, I read it. because I want to see if I did something wrong. If they give me legitimate feedback, even if they call me names through 90% of it, if they give me legitimate feedback, I'm going to take it and I'm going to fix my problem. And to me, that's just being a responsible journalist. I'm not going to write off people just because they, are mean to me or something like that. And so, yeah, if they have legitimate feedback, I'll take it. If I made an error, I'll correct it. Honestly, I think it's pretty rare for me to make errors just because I really try to hold myself to pretty high standards. And I also try to get completeness of information. I do try to look at both sides. But again, I don't think it's possible to never make a mistake. But if I do make a mistake, I correct it.
Yeah, I wanted to have a chance to say that because it works better when you say it rather than me, because then I'm just a suck up. So I appreciate that. Let's talk about, since the last time we talked, the whole COVID thing was breaking out. Actually, I met you in New York as New York was shutting down. It's a lot different now. What are your thoughts on what you've learned over the last 2 months as we, I don't want to say pull out of the dive, but as we get further into the understanding of COVID and what it means for a place like New York City or the United States?
Well, I understand some of the different views on COVID. I think the biggest problem we have is that it's been politicized. It's become a political issue, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that that's happened. And there are a lot of conservatives, for example, who they believe that governments are trying to institute tyrannical policies during this time. There are some governments that have double standards. In New York, we see it, for example, where you can't go join, you can't go to church, for example. If you're Jewish, you can't go to synagogue. You have mass arrest if you go to a funeral of a rabbi, but you can go mass protest on the street and break into buildings and burn stuff down. That's okay. This is the message that they've been sending. This double standard. De Blasio was saying that if you go to the beach and you go in the water, he's going to send officers to go pull you out of the water. Governor Cuomo actually did, in fact, deploy the National Guard in small numbers during the crisis, during the height of it. And now, being fair, Cuomo does seem to support bringing in the National Guard. It's de Blasio who doesn't want to have the National Guard in New York. So yeah, there's double standards. It's been politicized. From my own personal perspective, in my own analysis, I really think COVID is a serious, serious threat. And I know a lot of conservatives don't think that's the case. It's actually been more the Democrats who've been saying publicly that they think it's more of a risk, and the conservatives don't think so. A lot of them are wondering, why are you keeping us on lockdown? Why are you shutting down businesses? And why are you implementing policies that seem pretty dang tyrannical? They're worried about things like forced vaccinations, for example. They're worried about government control of their health. They're worried about these tracking, contact tracing programs they want to make to see who you come in contact with. These things do have long-term implications. I think, again, this ties to the politicization of the virus. But in my analysis, watching what's happening in China and watching the damage it's caused in China, and I mean, pretty serious stuff, I really think this thing is serious. Personally, I think around fall this year, maybe around October, we're going to see that. I think the first wave was not the big one. I think the second wave is going to be the big one. That's my personal analysis, and this is based on what's happening and based on really watching and reporting pretty actively on what I've been seeing happening in China.
We've already heard, and you're already getting the sentiment right now that if there is a second wave, we cannot afford to lock ourselves down like we did for the first one. And this is worth, I work for a college and a university. We're 100% online, so it doesn't affect us. But for all the resident schools that take place, I'm getting emails from my kids' school and from my alma mater that we're all coming back to school, and well, now there's a chance that they might not come back to school, or they might be doing some hybrid path, and what I'm getting to the point with in terms of a lot of these, especially public schools, they cannot afford not to come back. They, especially a college and university, they cannot afford. There's several. I think it's like 42% of schools and universities are at a 90-day. They're 90 days out from in terms of operating budget and expenses and how far they can operate without income. Not having tuition, not having that means no football season, no sports, no anything. Several of these schools are not going to survive a second wave if they lock it down in the same manner. So there's, I think I'll say we shot our wad on this first one. I don't think we have enough left to withstand a second wave, and that's where you're getting not pushback because of what Josh was saying, that he doesn't think that there's a second wave. It's just like, look, we can't afford it. Even if there is a second wave, we have to do something else that keeps us in business.
And I agree with that too. Actually, I think it's complicated. That said, I'm not fully convinced either that the lockdown system is effective. For example, Taiwan didn't do it, and they're actually doing really well. And being so close to China, you would have thought they would have got hit a lot harder. There are some places, but at the same time, Sweden, for example, didn't lock down, and they're one of the worst places dealing with this virus right now. And so it's hard to say how effective the lockdowns are. I mean, as terrible as it is, we're probably going to see within a few weeks whether that is effective because of these protests.
Right.
Now you've had, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. I don't even know. A lot of people in very close proximity to each other in very large numbers for days at a time. Shouting, breathing in, you name it. We're going to see within a couple weeks whether these lockdowns were necessary or not, whether they were effective or not.
I know we were talking earlier about we're going to need volunteers to go back to work to see if it's going to be safe. Well, we got our volunteers. Whether they were witting or unwitting, these folks that came out, and you hate to say it as a side result, all the folks that are tracking the virus, and this is a perfect test or change of the norm to see if this is going to pan out. So either we're going to get a ton of sick people, or all the models that we were using in the past and the advice we were giving is not working.
At the same time too, the idea of contact tracing is gone now. After these protests, the entire concept of contact tracing, it's dead. There's no way you can contact trace now that you've had these big protests. Right. I mean, what are you going to say? Were you on the street protesting with 100,000 other people this day? Going to go contact trace 100,000 people? That entire program is dead in the water now.
Right.
In other words, but if we do have a second wave, if it does turn out this is a big deal, how are you going to contain it at this point? And like you said too, I also don't think that you can. Even if it turns out that the lockdowns were effective, can we survive as a country with continued lockdowns? I don't know at this point either. Right. And so if we do have a second wave, especially now post mass protest, and notably in New York prior to these big protests, that the government said you weren't allowed to protest. For example, if you wanted to protest against a lockdown, they would arrest you. They banned protests in New York. Now they've had this. We'll see. Honestly, personally, I'm not very hopeful about it. I'm not hopeful at all about where things are heading with the second wave.
I wanted to ask you about Mike Pompeo's statement about the intel supporting something other than a wet market breakout. Now, I know you and I talked about patient zero not even having a connection with the Wuhan market, but how has your position evolved with the outbreak source itself? Has anything new come to light since we talked about 2 months ago?
Epoch Times frequently gets leaked documents from within China. Pretty much we're an independent media. We were started by Chinese dissidents in the United States back in, I think, 2000. And that was in response to basically Chinese Americans wanting to create originally a Chinese news outlet that could not be censored. We actually did have some staff in China in the beginning. All of them were arrested. Our editor spent 10 years in prison, and they tortured him. Actually, some human rights organizations were actually involved in this case. But because we've never folded to the Chinese Communist Party, because we've held our ground all these years, the Chinese people respect us to an extent, at least the ones who know about us in the mainland. And so anytime they want to get information out, anytime they want to defect and tell people something, they always come to us, almost always. because we're the only media they trust. And so, I mean, almost on a daily basis, we're getting leaked documents from China. One of the recent leaked documents we had is actually a government report on the Wuhan Market analysis, and it shows that not a single animal there they didn't find the virus with any animal at that marketplace. And it's coming out now. Yeah, they believe that the market was like a super spreader event, that the marketplace somehow was one of the places where the virus spread. The question is now, it didn't come from the market, where it did come from. It seems all eyes now are on the possibility that it was a lab leak, that it was from one of these virus laboratories that did have viruses very close to this one. That said, I mean, I did a big documentary on this. I'm sure a lot of people saw it. Tracking the origins of the Wuhan coronavirus. Of course, we had other researchers involved. I was kind of the main face on that. We presented many cases. I did that documentary was not intended to come to hard conclusions. It was to show evidence. And so we showed evidence. Did it come from the laboratory? Did it come from the Wuhan marketplace? Was it man-made? Was it natural? We showed different pieces of evidence on this, and I didn't draw conclusions on that. Personally, this is my analysis. Personally, I do not think it was man-made. Personally, I do think it was a natural virus, but I do think it leaked from that laboratory. Based on all this research, I mean, I'm willing to be proven wrong on this. If it comes out tomorrow that, hey, it was man-made, honestly, I'd shrug my shoulders and say, oh yeah, why not? But personally, I do think it was a natural virus, because based on the research we did, we actually showed some of the documentary. This Yunnan bat virus does seem to be very close to it. They did have natural viruses that were very similar, and also there's a lot of evidence suggesting that they did not have very good security at that laboratory, that they did have safety issues. And there were some big media such as Washington Post that came out with articles saying that as well. State Department cables actually from last year were saying this. Last year or 2018, I can't remember now off the top of my head. And so they were saying this. So yeah, I mean, that's where things are at now. It seems more like evidence is coming out to support what our findings had said.
Joshua, one of the stories.
My coworkers that I'm in an interview.
No problem.
It's a busy newsroom. It's all right. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're in a newsroom. Yeah.
One of the stories that had come out related to the outbreak was that not necessarily that it was made in a lab, but it was one of the reasons why the secrecy is that the Chinese were attempting to come up with a vaccine for it, or try to prove to the world that they could outdo the U.S. in viral countermeasures, and that's one of the reasons why they were working it within the lab, and that's one of the reasons why it was able to escape it from that, because of how they were working on. Did you have any insight into that?
I think that's accurate. I think that's totally accurate. Yeah, that laboratory. I mean, one of the most prominent coronavirus researchers in the world was at that laboratory, this Dr. Shi Zhengli. They call her the Bat Woman of China. And she was, I mean, she documented her findings, traveling to all corners of the world, going to these bat caves, getting bat coronaviruses, researching them, bringing them to that laboratory. She wrote about creating synthetic viruses. One of the viruses, for example, was a chimeric virus. They tested it on mice, notably a bat coronavirus. I believe that they had merged with the SARS virus somehow. It was a chimeric virus. And they tested it on mice. They showed that it would destroy the lungs of mice. It had no cure. And in fact, her paper on that shocked the Western community. People were concerned about it. People said, if this got out, you could not predict the trajectory. In other words, you couldn't predict how it would spread and the amount of harm it would cause. And so, yeah, she was writing about this stuff. And, based on, this is the way I've been viewing these things. I know how the Chinese Communist Party reacts and does, deals with issues like this. 10,000 people dying in China. The Chinese Communist Party will do that in a day in Xinjiang province if they have to. Throwing 10,000 Uyghurs in a concentration camp and using them for slave labor, even bringing them into Wuhan for slave labor during this whole thing, because they don't want to hurt the people they care about. They want to hurt the people they want to get rid of, right? They don't care about that. 10,000 people dying in China under the Chinese Communist Party, it's whatever. They're not going to lock down their city for it. They're not gonna destroy their economy over it. They're not going to damage their international image over it. And so when the Chinese Communist Party takes actions during one of the most crucial times, in other words, let's look at this, right? When did this virus break out? It was right ahead of the Chinese New Year, biggest travel time of China. We have about 3 billion travel arrangements within China. It happened right around that time. It happened in Wuhan, the transit hub of all of China. In other words, whatever happens in Wuhan spreads all around China. It happened right at the height of the Hong Kong protests, when the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party was under fire. It happened right at the height of the U.S.-China trade war, but right when they were trying to sign a deal with the United States. And it happened right when Taiwan voted into power a party that is opposed to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, in addition to all of that, you have a virus outbreak that causes the regime to have to lock down its transit hub right ahead of some of the major political meetings they were going to be having. Right ahead of the Chinese New Year, right amidst all of this, and then they want to lock down all the businesses and shut down the Chinese economy when their economy is already reeling. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party essentially through this virus, it has decimated the Chinese economy. It has decimated decades of work they were doing with soft power, these foreign influence operations, because of the way things played out. This has gone so far against the interests of the Chinese regime that, I mean, honestly, I don't know if they're going to survive this. And my point in saying this is they would not do that if this was not a really, really big deal. And unless they had internally assessed that the possible carnage that this could cause if they didn't react like that would be more detrimental to the party than basically destroying their entire economy and their world image, which for the regime is its two main holds. Those are its two main holds on power, right? Ideology and money. That's about it.
That's a lot, man. I mean, that's not the kind of breakdown you get on a lot of other news outlets. When you talk about your leak documents, what variety, and I'm not asking you to expose sources, but what kind of variety of leaked documents are this? I mean, like I get the handwritten note, like there's weapons in the cemetery, but like that's not a real leaked document. Like, what are you guys receiving in terms of the quality of it? And are these sources proving to be reliable, repeatedly reliable?
Absolutely. I mean, and we know how to sift through the disinformation. Now this is one area I'd say where a lot of media falter. I'll say this first, then go deeper into what you just asked. This is where a lot of media falter when they try to cover China. It is so easy to manipulate media that it is sickening. It is so easy to do it. The Chinese Communist Party has at least 3 branches focused on foreign manipulation. There's the United Front Work Department, which has overseas